I will introduce our next speaker, Dr. Terrie Dopp Aamodt. Dr. Aamodt earned a Ph.D. in American and New England Studies from Boston University and taught English and history at Walla Walla University for 42 years. She is the author of Righteous Armies, Holy Cause, Apocalyptic Imagery, and the Civil War, and Bold Venture, A History of Walla Walla College. With Gary Land and Ronald numbers, she edited Ellen Harmon White, American Prophets, from the Oxford University Press. And at present, she is completing Ellen White, Voice and Vision for the Adventist Pioneers Biography Series. Today, Dr. Aamodt will be presenting on Ellen White's travel writing, the proving ground for her final chapters of the Great Controversy. Dr. Aamodt, you have up to 45 minutes for your presentation. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. I have just a few illustrations that will go on from time to time in my presentation as I talk about them. Ellen White faced a writing problem shared with few other authors. How would she lend a sense of immediacy and vivid pictorial description to events that had not yet occurred? Any author, even an inspired one, needs to draw on familiar language and images to communicate a vision of what lies ahead. Ellen White honed her descriptive writing skills in her accounts of her travels by wagon, horseback, train, and ship. Wielding her eye for detail and her talent for vivid narrative, she also researched information on the sites she visited and observed. The 19th century provided visual vocabularies more diverse than those found within the frame of a landscape painting or the stiff, formal contexts of studio photographs. Long before the medium of cinema developed, 19th century Romantic writers created narrative styles with cinematic qualities of continuous motion and dynamic visual interpretations and descriptions. 19th century culture also included panoramic paintings, some of which moved on rollers and were as long as a quarter of a mile, and elevated drawings providing bird's eye views witnessed firsthand by only a few brave balloon passengers. As White bisected the United States by rail, navigated the Rockies by wagon and horseback, steamed up the Pacific coast and through the Columbia Gorge, wore out the transcontinental train tracks in the United States, and threaded routes through the Swiss Alps, she enjoyed capturing those experiences visually for family and friends. Her written descriptions of these scenes were informal, but not casual. She clearly relished crafting them. She would apply these skills as she described the events leading up to Christ's second coming and what follows. Drawing on a lifetime of creating vivid description through pictorial writing in her memoirs and accounts of her travels, her knowledge of print reproductions in Bibles and other publications, and her views of art in person, White created graphic depictions of end-time events that resonate with 19th century literary and pictorial conventions and aesthetic standards. Her recreations of a spectacular Pacific storm or the dizzying views from alpine precipices evoked the power of the sublime as defined by Edmund Burke. And what topic could be more sublime than the approaching apocalypse? White refined and applied her descriptive writing skills to depictions of sights yet unseen in the final chapters of the Great Controversy. And I'm going to need a little coaching here. Oh, okay, here we go. I thought I was not understanding how this screen share works and accustomed to using a different platform. I think I'm good, thank you. The aesthetic principles underlying 19th century visual culture were established by the conventions of literature and art, from John Milton to J.M.W. Turner and Frederick Church. These characteristics ultimately influenced the illustrated books and prints familiar to Ellen and James White. The ways that 19th century religious writers and artists described the vivid drama of the apocalypse or the beauties of the heavenly realm owed a great deal to certain aesthetic theorists. The British philosopher and politician Edmund Burke, in his 1757 treatise, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, sought to identify and describe two polar opposites in visual culture. Burke's rugged, fear-inspiring, highly masculinized sublime consists of, he said, whatever operates in a manner analogous to terror is the source of the sublime and is productive of the strongest emotion that the mind is capable of feeling. His less dramatic but prettier, highly feminized, beautiful, on the other hand, inspired love rather than terror. The beautiful is that quality in those bodies by which they cause love or some passion similar to it. In Burke's terms, the vast, great, rugged, negligent, dark, gloomy, bold, massive, built on pain, sublime, and the small, smooth, polished, light, delicate, founded on pleasure, beautiful, epitomize Ellen White's descriptions of the sublime apocalypse and the beautiful heavenly city in the closing chapters of The Great Controversy. Indeed, the art historian David Morgan has termed the Protestant revivalist treatment of apocalyptic themes the evangelical sublime, a genre that is startling and at times disturbing. As Ellen White navigated these descriptions, she encountered the problem of creating a turbulent, violent end of the known world, more dramatic and memorable than the well-ordered prettiness of the holy city that emerges afterward. That was a familiar dilemma, one that poet William Blake articulated in his comments on Paradise Lost and the Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And Blake would go on to create numerous illustrations of Milton's poem and the book of Revelation. Pretty wild stuff. Seeking an intense experience of the sublime in his visual art. In the 19th century equivalent of IMAX cinematography, epic landscape painters such as J.M.W. Turner and John Martin sought to capture the sublime, catch in the throat impact of vertiginous precipices in the Alps or biblically described displays of God's wrath. In the United States, Frederick Church, Albert Bierstadt, Thomas Moran would seek similar effects via the American landscape. Theorists who followed in Burke's wake sought to define an aesthetic that would combine aspects of the sublime and the beautiful. The late 18th century artist and cleric William Gilpin sought to make the beautiful features of landscape interesting by disrupting their smoothness with aspects of roughness and ruggedness, a quality he termed picturesque, in other words, like a picture, to achieve effects more harmonious than a pure dose of the sublime and more interesting than the strictly beautiful. Soon another British theorist, Euvdil Price, further distinguished the sublime and beautiful aspects found in nature from the use put to them by the art of the picturesque. Gilpin and Price favored the landscape styles of Nicolas Poussin, Claude Lorrain, and many other imitators. Now, we can be quite certain that Ellen White never read Burke, Gilpin, or Price, but those writers did not invent the concepts they defined and methodized. Rather, they highlighted qualities that had already existed. Further, their definitions did shape the world of visual art that Ellen White and others like her saw in prints and illustrated books. And they also influenced the vivid written travel narratives that she admired, copied, and eventually emulated. 19th century Bible illustrators sought to capture the intense imagery of the biblical text in folio-sized volumes, such as the Big Bible, published by Joseph Teal in 1822 and purchased by the Robert Harmon family, as described by Ronald Graybill. Teal's artists drew on a variety of well-known American-born and European painters and artists, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. Different artists, so there's no consistent style, in their engraved pictures for the Big Bible, lending immediacy to the historical events and prophecies described in the Bible. A few decades later, about mid-19th century, became a career for the French graphic designer Gustave Doré, whose Bible illustrations shaped the visual culture of mid-19th century Europeans and Americans as thoroughly as Uncle Arthur's The Bible Story has done more recently for generations of American Adventist children. And you can see quite a transformation in the style between the Teal Bible and the Doré Bible. Doré's style, in turn, made an impact on the religious illustrators who were employed to provide engravings for gift editions of Ellen White's books and other Adventist publications. Ellen White avidly read John Milton's Paradise Lost. We know some things about that from earlier today. And she paralleled his extra biblical narrations of certain events on heaven and earth before creation in some of her own writings. What one critic described as Milton's acute and sometimes astonishing images that grew out of his reading and imagination could apply to her writing as well. White was drawn to this vivid pictorialism and its nearly cinematic effects. She likely would not have read the poetry of Percy Shelley or Walt Whitman, surely infidel authors in her view, but their visual, even cinematic techniques, such as Shelley's description of the frantic autumnal west wind on whose stream, mid the sky's commotion, loose clouds like decaying leaves are shed, or the slow motion descent of the ice fields on Mont Blanc, the glaciers creep like snakes that watch their prey from their far fountains, slow rolling on. And Whitman's Yankee Clipper is under her 3 sky sails. She cuts the sparkle and scud. These kinds of techniques helped shape 19th century visual culture. At some point, Ellen White almost certainly heard renditions of the Battle Hymn of the Republic with its vivid visual images. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. I have read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. These authors all sought to recreate panoramic scenes with immediacy and heightened realism. Ellen White was a very visually attuned person, and this characteristic was likely enhanced in the aftermath of her childhood injury, when for years she was unable to read for more than a few minutes at a time. She soaked in visual images, and she described them vividly. Her descriptions of her childhood teem with things she saw, such as the Aurora Borealis display that occurred a few months after her accident, and stained the night sky such a deep red it was almost felt rather than seen. When Eunice Harmon noticed the otherworldly red hue reflected in the snow, she picked up Ellen, now featherlight, and carried her to the window. The heavens were lighted up, the sky looked red and angry and seemed to open and shut, Ellen recalled. The snow looked like blood. The neighbors were much frightened. At peace with her soul, and apparently with nothing to look forward to in this life, Ellen had other thoughts. I was happy. I thought Jesus was coming, and I longed to see him. My heart was full. I clapped my hands for joy and thought my sufferings were ended. She was saddened the next morning to see an ordinary sight out the window. Around the time of her baptism into the Methodist faith in 1842, Ellen had 2 spiritually significant dreams with powerful visual images. In the first, a temple filled with worshipers collapsed and everything went dark, leaving her left alone in the silent horror of night. In the other, she was experiencing a spiritual mental block, believing that her Heavenly Father was a stern authoritarian, even cruel. Then an angel guided her to see Jesus, who, laying his hand upon my head, said, "Fear not." Her angelic guide then handed her a green cord representing her faith. And she recalled the beauty and simplicity of trusting in God began to dawn upon my soul. These dreams gave her a visual vocabulary to describe her spiritual life. And although she would not have been familiar with the terminology, the visual images from these 2 events had elements of the sublime and beautiful. Ellen White employed visual images in her travel narratives that featured her relish for detail. When Ellen and James discovered the mountain scenery of Colorado in 1872, she developed new imagery that soared beyond whatever heights New England and Michigan might have offered. Such a scene I had never looked upon before, White commented. Snow lying on top of the mountains, bordered with green as they approached Denver. The following summer, they explored the heart of the Rockies on a wagon trip across the Continental Divide to Grand Lake and Middle Park. We could trace the wonders of God's works in the grand towering mountains and abrupt rocks, in the beautiful plains and in the groves of pines. The variegated trees showing the marks of autumn were interspersed among the living green pines, presenting to our senses a picture of great loveliness and beauty. This scene, with its sublime and beautiful elements, qualified as picturesque. White also found spiritual lessons in natural settings close to home. On the last day of May 1877, a Thursday, patients in the Battle Creek Sanitarium were taken to a picnic on the shores of nearby Gogwak Lake, and Ellen White was invited to speak to the gathering. She later recalled a scene that could have come straight from Burke's definition of the beautiful. It was one of the fairest days of early summer, she reported to Edson and Emma. The blue waters spread out like a mirror under the sunlight, while the groves skirting the lake were reflected upon its placid surface. The people gathered upon the green turf beneath those lofty forest trees and listened attentively while I sought to lead their minds from nature up to nature's God. White connected the springtime flowers with their varied, delicate hints to the great master artist. She referenced gospel descriptions of the words of Christ upon the lakeside, in the groves, and on the mountains, and the lessons they taught him should be repeated to us by the familiar objects of nature that surround us. Her words on that occasion anticipated the opening lines of her spiritual classic, Steps to Christ, that she would publish 15 years later. As skilled as she was describing a peaceful, beautiful scene, White did not shy away from depicting her personal excursions into the sublime. In 1878, she boarded the steamer Oregon in San Francisco Bay on a breezy day in June. After threading through the Golden Gate, the Oregon encountered a howling northerly wind on the open Pacific. The ship creaked and rolled as it turned to starboard to head north and slammed into the heavy oncoming waves, sending sheets of water over the few hardy souls shivering on deck. One by one, the passengers crept below decks, fearing for their lives one minute and hoping for oblivion the next, overcome by seasickness. Soon the only passenger above decks was 50-year-old Ellen White. She stayed above and watched the waves because she did not want to go below and get seasick, and it was less frightening to watch the waves than it was to lie below, imagining what they looked like. She later recalled, I watched the clouded sky, the rushing waves leaping mountain high, and the spray reflecting the colors of the rainbow. The sight was fearfully grand, and I was filled with awe while contemplating the mysteries of the deep. It is terrible in its wrath. There is a fearful beauty in the lifting up of its proud waves and roaring and then falling back in mournful sobs. I could see the exhibition of God's power in the movements of the restless waters, groaning beneath the action of the merciless winds, which tossed the waves up on high as if in convulsions of agony. Sublime scenery must include an element of danger, and at this point, there was a very real risk that her steamer would join the other vessels sitting on the bottom of the coastline on the San Francisco to Portland run. She reported in Signs of the Times, I could not become weary of looking upon that grand scene, and I reflected how easily all on board might be engulfed by the angry waters. In spite of the apparent danger, White had a reason to appear calm and brave to the other passengers in the ship's crew that day as she meditated on the New Testament story of Christ walking on the water in the Sea of Galilee. There was an unseen power holding a steady grasp upon the waters, she reflected. God alone has power to keep them within their appointed boundaries. Even a terrifying natural setting could lead her toward a spiritual conclusion. White's visual descriptions of divine lessons from nature were as fluent in the context of the sublime terror as they were in the pleasant pastures of beautiful imagery. She taxed her descriptive powers again during her travel to the Pacific Northwest later on. As she traveled down the Columbia River in the steamer D.S. Baker in 1880, she described the basalt cliffs lining the Columbia Gorge to her sister and brother-in-law, Mary and Samuel Foss. We come to rocks of singular formation, appearing as though an artisan had been laying an immense wall for a house. These rocks are the Palisades, stretching miles on the banks on the river. After the boat stopped to take on 4,000 pounds of wool, she described a picturesque scene which included another feature of rocks, looking altogether grand and solemn as though it was the ruins of an old city. 4 years later, she described for Uriah Smith her visit to the Multnomah Falls, in the lower Columbia Gorge. I undertook to go, and I would not go back. It was very steep. There would be steps made, then quite a zigzag, then more steps. This was repeated many times until we stood upon a bridge over a chasm above the first falls. The water pours from the top of a mountain about 900 feet high, and as the water descends, it breaks upon the jutting rocks, scattering off in a beautiful spray. Here was the most beautiful sight to look upon. This experience took her to the Christian sublime, a common thread in 19th century art. We feel subdued and awed in the presence of such manifestations of the great God, she noted, quoting Psalm 148, 3, 7, and 8. In February 1880, White traveled with several others from Battle Creek to California on the Transcontinental Railroad. On the long train trip, which was her 15th rail excursion across the country, Ellen White wrote a detailed journal letter to her twin, Lizzie Bangs. White's eye for detail, her vivid word pictures of the passing scenery, and her pithy comments about other passengers in this journal letter provide a fascinating picture of transcontinental train travel at that time. They boarded the Chicago and Northwestern Railway on Monday, February 23, heading toward the familiar Union Pacific route to San Francisco. By late Tuesday, the group arrived at the jumping off point at Council Bluffs, Iowa, and on Wednesday, they traveled on to Omaha, where they boarded the Union Pacific train bound for the West Coast. In Omaha, the travelers climbed aboard an uncrowded Palace sleeper car. Thursday morning, inspired by the railroad guidebook she was reading and drawing from as she wrote to Lizzie, White gave many details about the railroad grade and elevation gains as the train chugged up the Laramie grade with the diamond peaks of the Medicine Bow Range visible in the distance. The two engines puff and blow as if requiring a powerful effort to breathe, then descended toward Dale Creek Bridge, she reported, quoting the guidebook. It looks frail, as if incapable of sustaining the ponderous train, but it is built of iron and very substantial. The passengers looked down on the valley below, where settlements looked like pigeon houses. As the sable curtains of Thursday night drew around the train, the berths were prepared for sleeping. Unfortunately, a strong headwind forced the smoke and coal gas from the car's heating stove into every opening and crevice in the car. I slept but awoke with a suffocating scream. I found myself laboring hard for breath, and the coal gas was so stifling I could not sleep for hours, dared not sleep. This was the most disagreeable night that I had on the journey. On Friday, as the train approached Ogden, Utah, they passed the Green River, Wyoming, where a museum had preserved local curiosities, including specimens of fossils, petrifications, moss agates, petrified shells, and wood. Continuing to draw on her guidebook's visual descriptions, White reported that nearby stood a high projecting rock in appearance like a tower and twin rocks of gigantic proportions. The appearance of these rocks is as if some great temples once stood here and their massive pillars were left standing as witness of their former greatness. This guidebook writer was well practiced in picturesque descriptions. When the Adventist party reached Ogden Friday evening, they were quickly seated on the sleeping car headed for San Francisco. Slumber was elusive, though, as the light of a full moon shone over the landscape while they chugged across Utah. The sights only became more spectacular on Saturday evening when they crossed the California state line and traversed the Sierra Nevada. The wintry scene in the Sierra Nevadas, viewed by the light of the moon, is grand, White told Lizzie. We look 2,000 feet below, the soft light of the moon shining upon mountain heights, revealing the grand pines and lighting up the canyons. We prefer to enjoy this grand sight rather than to sleep. On Sunday morning, White noted they had traveled out of the winter of the Sierra Nevadas and of the Michigan landscape they had left behind into summer. They found themselves in a beautiful landscape. Although a plain people in almost every way, Seventh-day Adventists had always cherished vivid pictorial descriptions of their teachings, creating their own version of the Millerite prophetic chart in 1850. In 1863, James White published an updated prophetic chart and introduced a second print, The Law of God, depicting the Ten Commandments. The Millerite and Adventist prophetic charts were intended for use in public meetings. They might have been conversation pieces hanging on the walls of Adventist homes, but they were not intended for decorative residential display. During the second half of the 19th century, middle-class American households obtained and proudly hung prints of pictorial scenes on their parlor walls, many of them crafted by the well-known lithographers Nathaniel Currier and John Marriott Ives. The art historian David Morgan has traced the way Adventists developed their own schemes of parlor decoration. As Adventists became prosperous enough to adorn their homes with pictures, they began to consider how they might share their faith by depicting their beliefs in a unified pictorial composition, very different in character from the columns of individual images on the prophetic charts. Merritt Gardner Kellogg sought to meet this perceived need in 1873 by designing an allegorical print, The Way of Life, From Paradise Lost to Paradise Restored. This lithograph featured vignettes of the fall, the Old Testament sanctuary worship, Christ's baptism, and the Last Supper, flanking two central images. The Tree of Life dominated the composition with two banners containing the 10 Commandments hanging from its branches. The all-seeing eye of God peered through the leaves. A smaller image of Christ on the cross occupied the right foreground of the print. This print had some visual infelicities, especially for Adventists, the all-seeing eye that evoked Masonry and the US dollar bill. And James White hoped to locate a more highly skilled artist to upgrade the design. 3 years later, in the spring of 1876, James hired a well-known print illustrator, Emily Sartain, to produce an improved image for a new lithographic print. That summer, in July, the latter part of July, James and Ellen White had the opportunity for a significant encounter with European and American fine art at the Columbia International Exposition in Philadelphia. Sorry, the Centennial International Exposition. That was a slip of the tongue. Where they spent several days viewing the vast exhibition buildings in Fairmount Park. John Sartain, a leading American printmaker and the director of the exposition's Bureau of Art, and the father of Emily Sartain, assembled an enormous collection of loaned American masterpieces and European art from the collections of wealthy patrons and placed them from floor to ceiling in the memorial building. Since there were almost no public art galleries in the United States in 1876, most of the exposition's 10 million visitors had never seen collections of paintings before. And their closest encounters would have been the black and white print replicas designed by engravers such as Sartain and sold as individual prints or included in books and Bibles. Although the Whites provided few details of what they saw at the exposition, they likely viewed a monumental painting of their beloved Rocky Mountains, Mountain of the Holy Cross by Thomas Moran, who was then the leading landscape painter and a native in America and a native of Philadelphia. This work by Moran had an overtly religious theme as the mountain's natural creases formed a white cross when snow levels cooperated. It exemplified the evangelical sublime. In the same room with Moran's painting was a 15 by 30 foot panorama, just an enormous canvas, The Battle of Gettysburg by Peter Rothermel. Also near Memorial Hall, they could have viewed the monumental 20,000 square foot cyclorama, the largest oil painting ever exhibited up to that time, The Siege of Paris. The 1876 print that James White had commissioned from Emily Sartain, and this time with the advice of John Harvey Kellogg, had better pictorial coherence than Merritt Kellogg's older version and omitted the all-seeing eye. If Emily Sartain's print caught on with enough Adventists and other Christians to become a bestseller, it would enhance the church's publishing coffers handsomely. Ellen, who had discussed James' pet idea with him many times, also approved. The Way of Life is to be revised and improved in every way, she noted to Edson and Emma in July. Soon, however, James came to understand that the print's design, theology, and profitability could be enhanced even more. Conversations about the love of Christ that had emerged in Ellen White's letters through the 1870s, particularly in her letters to Edson and James, were part of a dialogue between her and James on the role of Christ's righteousness in salvation. Although the Adventist Church was growing rapidly, the Whites believed that its legalistic focus on Sabbath keeping, something they had stoked over the years, was diluting the most important message the church could be proclaiming in the earth's last days. The Adventist theologian Woodrow Wilson has noted during the late 1870s, the Whites comprehended a lack of Christ-centered emphasis in Adventist preaching and a theological misunderstanding of justification by faith, which was frustrating the work of the latter rain and the arrival of the long-anticipated loud cry. And they believed the Kellogg design prints were part of the problem. As James sought to redesign the Kellogg print in the spring of 1880, he reported to Ellen that the law tree is removed. Christ on the cross is made large and placed in the center. In other particulars, it is about the same, excepting the baptism scene in the heavenly city will be very much improved. In addition to adapting the images theologically, he also wanted to create a new print design that would reach the highest standards of American art and thus broadly appeal to Christians. With satisfaction, he reported to Ellen a few days later, with the increasing demand for our writings and the new way of life picture, there will be an income of several $1,000s annually, besides the immense amount of good our writings will do. He likely saw a role for his sons in this family industry he was creating. That fall, he told Willie, "I have a burden on me to preach Christ, Christ, Christ through the signs this winter, then in the spring have out a value to be translated in all the languages where there is a call for the book." He's speaking of a gift book to complement the new print he's working on. "I shall get out another print with this title, Christ, the Way of Life. I shall remove the tree, put Christ in the center, a little larger and prominent, then have one plate with baptism scene, one without it to sell to sprinklers, as marking pragmatism would take the designs beyond those who believed in baptism by immersion, and one to be mortgaged. These will be wonderfully improved." In January 1881, James began looking for the best artists he could find to draw his concept for engraving. He engaged the landscape painter Thomas Moran, meeting with him in New York, and was also Moran was an accomplished printmaker with a track record of creating effective religious images. Moran created the original image. An engraver prepared the printing plate. Sadly, the Moran print was not published before James died in August 1881. 2 years later, Ellen had it copyrighted and printed, and its contrast with its predecessors is both visually and theologically remarkable. Soon after The Third Way of Life was published in 1883, Ellen White left the United States for 2 years in Europe. Among many other things, this traveling was a gathering period for her third expansion of the Great Controversy narrative, completed in 1888. She collected historical sources, visited Reformation historical sites, and witnessed the most sublime images she encountered during her lifetime outside of her visions. In 1886, she and 3 others traveled by carriage through the Swiss Alps on roads that she said cannot be excelled, and she should have been one to know. The crushed stone roads were white as limestone and as level as the floor. But much more impressive were the rugged mountain peaks, a sight that constituted a J.M.W. Turner painting and a John Martin painting all rolled into one. Viewing the Alps made White think of creation, the entrance of sin, the flood, and the second coming. The scenery formed an allegory of her Christian faith, and the images were straight from the sublime. And I'll be quoting from a manuscript she wrote in 1886 during her travels. "The scenery through which we passed was altogether too majestic, too awfully grand to give anything like a description that can compare to the scenery as it really is. The battlements of rocks, the time-worn rocky walls that have stood since the flood, washed with the mountain torrents, stand out smooth as if polished, while rocks diverse from these in shape are seen in regular layers as if art had fashioned them. This scenery far exceeds anything we there witnessed in Colorado, and it carries one back to the period when the waters rose to the highest points of land and the unbelieving antediluvians perished for their great wickedness in the waters of the flood. And then I looked forward to the prospect of the day of the Lord's coming, cruel both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate and destroy the sinners thereof out of it. The mountains shake and tremble before the tread of the Lord's hosts. Before the glory of him is to reign, the mountains will tremble and bow, the rocks will be removed out of their place. For once more, the Lord will shake not alone the earth, but the heavens also." Ellen White was primed to write The Great Controversy Between Christ and Satan. Like her Millerite forebears, Ellen White saw the second coming in terms that evoked awe. As David Morgan has described it, the awful power of the sublime condemned and assaulted Miller with powerlessness and death. Fear of the end time, however, could be tempered by a counterpoint to frightening images and thoughts. Morgan further notes that the beauty of scriptural prophecy and evangelical surrender to Jesus rescued him from despair. And I will share with you, as I go through these final paragraphs, a few images from the 1888 Great Controversy, the illustrated version. This one was very sublime. It's historical events leading up to the end of time from the chapter, The Impending Conflict. In 1888, Ellen White tapped into that dynamic in her descriptions of the end of time and heaven. But for her, only the wicked would experience the fearful sublime at the impending return of Christ. And here's the illustration for that section. It is at midnight that God manifests his power for the deliverance of his people. The sun appears, shining in its strength. The wicked look with terror and amazement, while the righteous behold with solemn joy. Everything in nature seems turned out of its course. The streams cease to flow. Dark, heavy clouds come and clash against each other. In one clear space of indescribable glory comes the voice of God like the sound of many waters saying, "It is done." While White shared Miller's understanding that end-time prophecies tended to induce fear, her deflection of those fears onto the wicked created a safe space for the faithful to imagine these future scenes vividly, but out of harm's way. Containing their fears in this way would enable Adventists to maintain the dynamic tension between rationalism and emotionalism described by the Adventist historian George Knight in Millennial Fever and the End of the World. Like Miller, White also balanced her descriptions of the terrifying context of the end of time by appealing to readers' sense of the beautiful when she described heaven in vivid pictorial terms. She was drawn to natural beauty during her travels through Colorado, the Northwest, Switzerland, and Northern Italy. Her diaries and letters describing her surroundings are specific and detailed, and she painted these word pictures with skill and pure enjoyment. This aptitude is also apparent in her descriptions of heavenly visions. In her first vision, which occurred in December 1844, she just experienced the second advent and walked through heaven with Jesus to a table of pure silver, many miles in length, filled with the fruit of the tree of life and many other kinds of fruits. Ellen Harmon asked Jesus if she could have some. He said, "Not now. Those who eat of the fruit of this land go back to earth no more. But," he continued, "in a little while, if faithful, you shall both eat of the fruit of the tree of life and drink of the water of the fountain. In the meantime," he told her, "you must go back to the earth again and relate to others what I have revealed to you." An angel brought her back down to this dark world. After this vision, Ellen Harmon could not see the world as others saw it. Her terrestrial surroundings would never seem as beautiful as they had before her vision. "Sometimes I think I cannot stay here any longer. All things of earth look so dreary," she wrote about a year later. "I feel very lonely here, for I've seen a better land." More than 4 decades later, Ellen White described the descent of the Holy City to the new earth in visual terms and near the end of the Great Controversy. The tree of life yields its fruit every month. There are ever-flowing streams, clear as crystal. There are the wide-spreading plains, swell into hills of beauty, and the mountains of God rear their lofty summits. Beside these living streams, God's people, so long pilgrims and wanderers, shall find a home. Her descriptions appeal both to her readers' sense of beauty and to their emotions. Driven by her sense of homesickness for what she had just seen, her written accounts strive to make the visual beauty of heaven and its emotional drawing powers real for her readers as it was for her. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aamodt, for your presentation. Now we'll hear a response from Dr. Gabriel Masfa. He is a national from Cameroon, and he is currently a senior lecturer at the Adventist University of Africa in Kenya. Dr. Masfa is the editor-in-chief of the Pan-African Journal of Theology. He teaches and researches in the areas of church history and Adventist studies. He is the author of several articles, chapters, and books, including the forthcoming book, The Legacy of Ellen G. White in Africa, Contributions and Influence. Dr. Masfa, you have up to 10 minutes for your response.
Thank you so much. I appreciate Yvonne. Greetings to everyone. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. I've outlined my response into three parts with the intention to strengthen and highlight the significance of the paper. I would like to appreciate Prof. Aamodt for the paper that she has presented. The author is to be appreciated. She has written a thoughtful paper, and I've really enjoyed reading the paper. She examined the intersection of Ellen White's travel experiences and her apocalyptic writings. The paper offers valuable insight into the ways in which her visionary narratives were shaped by both personal encounters and broader historical context. I've really enjoyed it. And Ellen White's observations and experiences during her travel play a crucial role in shaping the concluding chapters of the Great Controversy, as the author of the paper has highlighted it very well. Scholars of religious history may find value in examining how first-hand experiences inform her apocalyptic and prophetic visions. The paper also provides an attempt to bridge religious studies, literary analysis, and historical geography by examining travel writing as a contributing factor in White's historical and even theological development. Also, the paper or the concept of a proving ground, as put in the title of the paper itself, suggests that her travels were a testing phase where ideas were refined, making the final chapters of the Great Controversy a product of lived experience. And this is really significant and is coming out well in the paper. For those studying Seventh-day Adventist history, these analyses could provide insight into how White's travels across different regions shaped the eschatological themes in her work. The second point, major point of my reflection is titled Historiographical and Philosophical Reflections. The author has referred to the work of key thinkers that have influenced the writings of Ellen G. White, especially the concept of the sublime and the beautiful. These concepts have been explored in various literary and philosophical works, including the Bible and John Milton's Paradise Lost. And I'm happy that Dr. Adrian Petra has referred to it. And of course, Prof. Aamodt has also reflected upon it. The sublime and the beautiful in the Bible. In the Bible, the sublime is often associated with the power and majesty of God. The Psalms, for example, describe God's creation as awesome and fearful. So the book of Job also portrays God's power and wisdom as sublime, beyond human comprehension. In contrast, the beautiful is often linked to the harmony and order of God's creation. The Bible describes the Garden of Eden as a beautiful and pleasant place, and the Psalms celebrate the beauty of God's creation. Now, in reference to Milton's Paradise Lost, in Paradise Lost, John Milton explores the concept of the sublime and the beautiful in the context of the fall of man. Milton's depictions of the Garden of Eden is a prime example of the beautiful, especially when we look at book number 4. However, Milton also employs the sublime to describe the terrifying consequences of Satan's rebellion. And the poem depictions of the war in heaven, for example, is a sublime and awe-inspiring spectacle. Milton's depictions of the sublime and the beautiful serves to underscore the moral and theological themes of the poem. The beautiful Garden of Eden represents the perfect harmony and order of God's creation, while the sublime, associated with the idea of danger, depicts Satan's rebellion and serves to emphasize the gravity of the fall and the consequences of human sin. Now, connection to Ellen White's writings. Ellen White's writing, particularly her descriptions of the end times and the heavenly realm, often employ the concept of sublime and the beautiful. Her depictions of the heavenly city, for example, is a beautiful and glorious place, while her description of the end time events are often sublime and awe-inspiring, as we find it well in the book The Great Controversy. And I agree with Prof. Aamodt that Ellen White was influenced by John Milton's vivid pictorialism in Paradise Lost, which inspired her own descriptive writing style. And of course, in the writings of Ellen G. White, elements of the sublime and the beautiful are reflected. And these elements serve to emphasize, in the writing of Ellen G. White, serve to emphasize the moral and theological themes of her writing, particularly the contrast between the beauty and glory of God's creation and the ugliness and destructions of sin. Human history is a battleground between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and that is well reflected as well in the book The Great Controversy. So this is in line with her own understanding of what history is. She views history as linear, moving from one point to an ultimate direction, which will lead to the second coming of Christ. It is important, therefore, to note that Ellen White was not just concerned about historical facts, but rather saw their theological significance. She did not write academic or scholarly history. She did, however, recognize that historical events are important and that their ultimate meaning can only be found by studying the Bible. Her historical reflections were based upon divine revelation, starting with the Bible. A historian generally describes historical events as originating from his or her immediate natural circumstances. He or she is not concerned about a divine agency in connection to historical events. Ellen White interpreted these same events from a broad religious framework because she saw God's involvement in history. Even in her travels, she interpreted these historical events or facts in that theological or religious framework. Thus, for her, theology and history were integrally connected. The history that matters for her was those events within the framework of God's action in time. Now, let me provide some few observations. If Ellen White's end-time writings are viewed primarily through the lens of her personal experiences and travel, it may lead to an overemphasis on individual interpretation and subjective experience. And this could undermine, I believe, the objectivity of her writings and her claim as a messenger of God. In her lending of immediacy to historical and prophetic events, as informed by her understanding of the sublime and beautiful or picturesque, she gave room to the unseen, and the author has well reflected upon it in the paper, which is supernatural, resulting from her own encounter with the divine. Ellen White herself said, well, while writing the manuscript of The Great Controversy, I was often conscious of the presence of the angels of God, and many times the sins about which I was writing were presented to me anew in visions of the night, so that they were fresh and vivid in my mind. Next, Ellen White should not be given the mantle of a scholar. She was a religious leader, a prophet, not a traditional scholar in the academic sense. Her writings, including The Great Controversy, were based on religious conviction and personal experiences rather than systematic historical or scholarly methodologies. The author should engage more, and I'm making suggestion here, the author should engage more substantively with the final chapters of The Great Controversy. As it stands, the content does not fully meet the high expectations set by the title. There is a stronger emphasis on Ellen White's writings on end-time themes from her various other works than a focused analysis of the Great Controversy itself, or more especially on the final chapters of the Great Controversy. I think focusing on the book, The Great Controversy, will do justice to the paper. Every section of the paper should engage more fully with the Great Controversy to highlight the historical, theological connection and intersections that are there between the sections. And also, the connections of visual arts to apocalyptic vocabularies and thinking in the Great Controversy should be strongly highlighted, and it should come out very well. The author needs more engagement, as I said earlier, with the book, The Great Controversy, especially the final chapters of The Great Controversy, as the title has promised. And finally, the concept of sublime and beautiful as understood and implied in the end-time writings of Ellen White need to come out as well more clearly. Thank you, and that is my response. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Masfa, for your thoughtful response. Dr. Aamodt, if you like, you may take up to 5 minutes to reply.
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate that very thoughtful response, very detailed response. What I was setting out to do here was kind of lay the groundwork or set the stage for the Great Controversy. I think it's probably another full paper to analyze the Great Controversy with that in mind. But what I'm interested in is the development of her descriptive writing, which I have watched unfold, over decades, and her obvious relish in being effective in her descriptions and becoming, I think, increasingly adept at translating these visual images, which she has experienced throughout almost her entire life, visions of heaven, and finding words to put with it. And I see a remarkable change in her descriptive writing after she travels to Colorado and sees things she's never seen before. And she starts to find a vocabulary because after all, describing your visions to people who have never seen those scenes, how are you going to put it into words that other people can grasp? And I think that something that aided her in that process were these things that she saw. And by the time, after she saturates herself during her European travels in all the literature she's gathering for her expanded Great Controversy, and she sees the Alps, and she sees all this record of human history in those rocks, it's a very powerful experience for her. And I think it sets the stage. And what I'm trying to do here is set the stage for the way we would then approach a close analysis of the Great Controversy. So there's more to be said and written, for certainly, but I've had kind of a lifelong interest in those last chapters of the Great Controversy. I read them as a teenager, and they were so powerful. And watching her go through her life and these experiences, and really, I think her travel writing is like I say, a proving ground, a way for her to find ways to get those visual images in her mind into words on the page. And those experiences seem to help provide that those choices of words that she uses to try to picture something it hasn't happened yet. So thank you.